When his young son falls critically ill, a billionaire CEO volunteers as a kidney donor, only for his wife to unexpectedly resist. But he soon finds out that her opposition hides a shocking truth that will change everything. Before we get started, leave a comment down below letting us know where you're watching from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now get comfortable, unwind, and let the story begin. Daniel Brown had spent his life solving impossible problems. As the CEO of Brown Enterprises, he had built an empire from the ground up, making calculated risks and decisions that always paid off. He was used to being in control, commanding boardrooms, and turning struggling businesses into billion-dollar successes. But now, as he sat in the sterile, white-walled hospital room, watching his son's small chest rise and fall, he had never felt more powerless. Noah had always been a bright, energetic child, full of curiosity and boundless energy. Just weeks ago, he had been running through the house, laughing as he played with his toy cars, begging his father to join him. Now, his little body was hooked up to machines, his skin pale, his once vibrant blue eyes dulled by exhaustion. The doctors had explained it in clinical terms: kidney failure, rapidly progressing, requiring an urgent transplant. Without it, his future was uncertain. Daniel barely heard anything beyond that. His mind had zeroed in on the solution: Noah needed a kidney, and Daniel would give him one. He had assumed there would be a process, some protocol to follow, but to him, it was simple. He would take the tests, and as soon as they confirmed he was a match, they would schedule the surgery. He didn't care about work, about business deals, about anything beyond his son's survival. Emma had been silent beside him, holding Noah's hand, her grip so tight that her knuckles had turned white. He had assumed it was fear. It was only natural. Any mother would be terrified in this situation. The next morning, they had met with the transplant specialist, a middle-aged doctor with a calm demeanor that did little to ease Daniel's nerves. The doctor explained the process, the risks, the possibilities. Then, the routine tests began. Daniel sat through the blood work, the scans, anything and everything necessary to determine his compatibility. He didn't hesitate. He didn't flinch. The only thing that mattered was getting that kidney into his son's body as soon as possible. That evening, as they sat together in the hospital waiting room, Daniel noticed Emma's fingers twitching in her lap. He reached for her hand, expecting comfort, but she pulled away before he could touch her. He frowned, studying her. "What's wrong?" he asked. She shook her head. I don't think we should rush into this." Daniel blinked, not sure if he had heard her correctly. "What?" Emma hesitated, biting her lip. "I mean, shouldn't we wait? For an anonymous donor?" For a moment, he thought she was joking. His wife was a level-headed woman, always practical and logical, which was why this made no sense. His expression darkened. "Why the hell would we wait? You heard what the doctor said. The sooner he gets the transplant, the better." Emma's eyes darted away, focusing on a speck on the hospital floor. "I just think we need to consider all options. What if a better match comes along?" Daniel felt his stomach twist. "Emma, I'm his father. I should be a perfect match." She flinched at his words, and it didn't escape his notice. His jaw tightened. "Unless there's something you're not telling me." "No," she said too quickly. "I just don't want to rush into anything. It's a major surgery, Daniel. For you and for him. That's a risk I'm willing to take." His voice was sharper than he intended, but he couldn't help it. "You're asking me to sit back and do nothing while our son gets worse?" Emma sighed, rubbing her temple. "It's not doing nothing. The transplant list exists for a reason." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, barely restraining his frustration. He had seen men hesitate in business, wavering in the face of difficult decisions, and he had always despised that kind of weakness. Now, watching his own wife act as though they had all the time in the world, he felt something close to fury. "Emma, be honest with me," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Why don't you want me to do this?" She swallowed hard, her fingers twisting the fabric of her sweater. She let out a shaky breath. I just think we should explore other options. That's not an answer, he shot back. Are you afraid for me? Is that it? She hesitated, and for a split second, something flashed in her eyes, guilt. A cold sensation settled in Daniel's stomach, something more unsettling than anger, more alarming than fear. He knew Emma. He knew when she was hiding something, and right now, she was practically drowning in whatever secret she wasn't telling him. He leaned forward, his voice low. Emma, what aren't you telling me? Her lips parted, then closed again. She turned away, shaking her head. Nothing. I just think we should wait. Daniel exhaled sharply, pressing his hands to his temples. This wasn't making sense. Emma loved Noah just as much as he did. What mother wouldn't want to save her child as quickly as possible? Why was she so resistant to something that could save their son's life? He felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing there was something beyond the edge but unable to see what lay below. The doctor returned a few minutes later, glancing between them with a professional yet gentle expression. Mr. Brown, we should have your test results back by tomorrow morning. If you're a match, we can move forward with the transplant discussion. Daniel nodded, but he could still feel Emma's tension beside him, radiating off her like heat. He wanted to press her further, to demand answers, but now wasn't the time. Right now, he needed to focus on Noah. He would get the results. He would be a match. He would save his son. And then, he would figure out what the hell was going on with his wife. The next morning, Daniel barely touched his coffee as he sat in the hospital cafeteria, staring blankly at the steaming cup in front of him. The weight of the previous night's conversation with Emma still sat heavy on his chest. He had always known her to be a cautious thinker, someone who analyzed every option before making a decision. But this was different. This was their son's life on the line, and yet she had fought him on something so simple, so obvious. He was Noah's father. He should be a match. He should be the one saving their child. And yet, she had insisted on waiting. His frustration only grew as he replayed her behavior, the way she had deflected, avoided eye contact, twisted her hands as if she were holding on to some invisible burden. She was hiding something, he knew it. But what? What could possibly be so terrible that she would rather let their son suffer than let Daniel donate? A nurse entered the room, calling his name, and his heart lurched. He followed her down the hall, his breath tight in his chest. When the doctor handed him the test results, Daniel scanned them quickly, his pulse pounding in his ears. He was a match. Relief flooded through him so intensely that he had to take a moment to steady himself. This was it. This was the answer. He could save Noah. But when he returned to the hospital room, expecting relief to wash over Emma's face, he was instead met with something else, something closer to dread. She stood stiffly by the bed, her fingers gently brushing Noah's hair as he slept. Her eyes lifted to Daniel's, and for a brief second, something flickered there. I'm a match, he said, watching her carefully. Emma exhaled, a slow, shaky breath, before nodding. That's good, she murmured, but there was no relief in her voice. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice so Noah wouldn't wake. That's all you have to say? She swallowed, her grip tightening on the railing of Noah's bed. Daniel, I don't want to hear another excuse, Emma, he interrupted, his patience hanging by a thread. I'm doing the transplant, and that's final. Emma's hands trembled. I just think we should wait a little longer. The anger he had been trying to contain finally broke through. What the hell is wrong with you? His voice was low but sharp, slicing through the quiet hum of machines in the room. I'm his father, Emma. I'm a perfect match. Why in God's name wouldn't you want me to save him? Emma's eyes filled with tears. She turned away, gripping the edge of the windowsill as though she needed something to hold her upright. Please, Daniel, just listen to me. Listen to what? He hissed, stepping closer. Listen to you tell me we should sit around and wait while Noah gets worse? No, Emma. I've had enough of this. You're hiding something, and I want to know what it is. She didn't answer. Daniel clenched his jaw, his voice dropping into something raw and desperate. Emma, is there something wrong with me? Is that why you don't want me to donate? She shook her head quickly, almost too quickly. No. It's not that. Then what? Her breathing became uneven. Her entire body tensed, and then, before he could press her further, she suddenly broke. The words tumbled out of her like she had been holding them in for years, each syllable landing like a physical blow. He's not yours. Daniel froze. The room around him faded, his vision narrowing until all he could see was her tear-streaked face. He had misheard her. He had to have misheard her. What? His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Emma covered her mouth with her hand, shaking her head, but it was too late. The truth was out now. Noah isn't biologically yours, Daniel. A numbness spread through him, a cold, hollow feeling that started in his chest and seeped into every inch of his body. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, because what the hell was he supposed to say to that? His mind fought against it, rejected it outright. No, he said finally, his voice sharper now. That's not possible. We were trying for a baby. Emma let out a small, broken sound. I know, she whispered. But I made a mistake. Daniel stared at her, his pulse roaring in his ears. A mistake, he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. She nodded, tears slipping down her face. It happened overseas years ago. It was fleeting, I didn't plan for it. She took a shaky breath, looking at him with something close to pleading. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought it was from him. But I wanted it to be ours, Daniel. I wanted so badly for it to be ours. And we were trying, and the timing, it was so close that I convinced myself it didn't matter. That it was better this way. Daniel's stomach twisted violently. Better? His voice cracked, anger and devastation fighting for dominance. You thought lying to me about my own son was better? Emma flinched. I didn't want to hurt you. He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. Well, congratulations. You did it anyway. The weight of her confession pressed down on him, suffocating, crushing. His entire world had just shifted beneath him, and he didn't know how to stand anymore. For 6 years he had been a father. For 6 years he had loved Noah with every fiber of his being. And now? What? Was he supposed to stop? To walk away? To unlove the child he had held in his arms, taught how to ride a bike, kissed goodnight every single evening? He turned away, running a hand over his face as he tried to breathe, tried to make sense of any of this. His voice was quieter when he spoke again, but it was sharp as a blade. You should have told me. Emma wiped at her tears. I know. No, he said, his chest tightening. You don't. Because if you did, you never would have kept this from me. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Daniel's heart ached, his mind spinning with emotions too tangled to unravel. He thought about Noah, about his tiny hands grasping his own, about the way his face lit up whenever Daniel walked through the door. That was his son. Blood or not, that was his son. And now, nothing would ever be the same. Daniel sat in his car outside the hospital, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The confession replayed in his head on an endless loop, over and over again, each time cutting deeper. He's not yours. Emma's words had sliced through him with a precision so sharp it had left him gutted hollow. He had spent 6 years believing Noah was his son, loving him without hesitation, without doubt. And now, with a few words, everything had changed. His mind kept circling back to the details, the way Emma had hesitated, the way she had avoided looking at him, the way she had begged him not to rush into the transplant. It had never been about the surgery. She had been trying to buy time, to delay the inevitable, to stop him from finding out what she had been hiding for years. But the worst part, the part that made his stomach churn with betrayal, was that she hadn't told him because she thought it didn't matter. She had made a decision for him, had rewritten the truth of their family to fit what she wanted, and in doing so, She had robbed him of the right to know his own son's origins. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face, trying to steady himself, but the anger, the grief, the sheer weight of what he had lost, pressed down on him like a crushing force. He wanted to scream, to break something, to lash out in the way his entire body ached to do, but none of it would change the truth. The truth was that the child lying in that hospital bed, the child he had raised, protected, loved, was not biologically his. And yet, even as that reality threatened to consume him, another thought whispered beneath it, one that he couldn't ignore. Does it matter? Noah was still his son. No piece of paper, no biology, no careless mistake from the past could undo the love he had for that boy. But the betrayal? That was something else entirely. The pain of Emma's deception was a wound so deep, he wasn't sure it could ever heal. He knew, in that moment, that their marriage was over. There was no coming back from this. No amount of apologies or explanations could fix what she had broken. With a deep breath, he pushed open the car door and made his way back inside. He had a test to take. Emma was still in Noah's hospital room when he returned. She was sitting by his bedside, stroking his hair gently, watching him sleep with that same tender expression she always had. If he hadn't known the truth, if this had been any other day, he might have found comfort in the sight. But now, all he saw was the woman who had lied to him for 6 years. She looked up as he entered, her face streaked with dried tears. "Daniel," she started, voice shaky, but he held up a hand. "I don't want to hear it," he said, his tone clipped cold. Emma flinched as if he had struck her. "Please, just let me explain. I don't need an explanation." His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the steel in it. "You lied to me. For years. You let me believe he was mine while you carried this secret, and you would have let me go the rest of my life never knowing." Tears welled in her eyes, but Daniel refused to let himself soften. "Not now. Not after what she had done. I never meant to hurt you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Well, you did." He let the words hang between them, let her feel the weight of them, before he continued. "But none of that changes what I have to do. I took the test. If I'm a match, I'm donating." Emma's eyes widened slightly, and he saw it again, that flicker of uncertainty. "Daniel, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he cut in. "Because whatever you did, however much you lied, none of that is Noah's fault. He's my son, Emma. Maybe not by blood, but in every way that matters. And I will not let him suffer because of your mistakes." Emma let out a small, choked sob, pressing a hand to her mouth. "I never wanted this to happen," she whispered. Daniel clenched his jaw. "You never wanted me to find out." She looked away, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, and he turned from her, unable to stand the sight of her pain, not because he felt sorry for her, but because he hated how much of him still wanted to. The results came in the next morning. Daniel was a match. The relief was immediate, but it was quickly overshadowed by everything else. He had expected it, he had never doubted that he would be able to do this for Noah, but the confirmation only reinforced the reality that no matter how shattered he felt, his love for that boy would always come first. There was no hesitation when he told the doctors to move forward with the transplant. Emma had been quiet when he told her. She had simply nodded, pressing a hand to her lips, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. Regret? Gratitude? Maybe both. But he didn't stay to analyze it. He didn't have the energy to. The night before the surgery, Daniel sat by Noah's bedside, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. The machines beeped softly around them, a constant reminder of how fragile everything had become. He reached out, brushing a hand over Noah's tiny fingers, and a lump formed in his throat. Noah stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering open. "Daddy?" His voice was weak, but it still had that sleepy innocence Daniel had always loved. "I'm here, buddy," Daniel murmured, forcing a smile. Noah blinked up at him. "Are you still mad at Mommy?" Daniel's breath hitched, but he swallowed it down. "That's not something you need to worry about." Noah frowned, his little fingers gripping Daniel's hand. I don't want you to fight. Daniel exhaled slowly, pressing a kiss to his son's forehead. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, he said gently. But no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you. Noah gave a small, sleepy nod before his eyes fluttered shut again, and Daniel sat there in the dim light, holding on to his son's hand, knowing that no matter how broken he felt, this was the one thing that would never change. Tomorrow, he would save his son's life. And after that, he would figure out how to rebuild his own. The morning of the surgery arrived, draped in a heavy silence. Daniel had spent the night in Noah's hospital room, watching over him, listening to the slow, steady beeping of the machines that monitored his fragile little body. Sleep had been impossible. His mind was restless, torn between the weight of Emma's betrayal and the urgency of what lay ahead. But none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was Noah. Emma had been quiet since the test results came back, her face drawn, eyes shadowed with something unreadable. She hadn't asked why Daniel was a match when, by all logic, he shouldn't have been. She hadn't questioned the impossible. Instead, she had accepted it the way one accepts a miracle, with silent reverence and lingering fear. But Daniel had seen the flicker of confusion in her expression when the doctor confirmed his compatibility. It was the kind of doubt that crept in when a truth you believed in started to unravel. Now, as the nurses prepped him for surgery, he caught Emma standing just outside the doorway, arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked small, fragile in a way he hadn't seen before. When she noticed him watching, she hesitated before stepping inside. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. Daniel let out a quiet breath, shaking his head. "Yes, I do." Emma swallowed hard, her gaze flickering to Noah, who was still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm raging between the two people he loved most. "Daniel, She stopped herself, pressing her lips together before trying again. "I never wanted to take this from you." He studied her for a long moment. There had been a time when he had loved her with everything in him, when he had trusted her completely. But that time was gone. He could see the remorse in her eyes, the regret etched into her features, but it didn't change what had happened. "You already did," he said quietly. "But this isn't about you. Or me. It's about Noah. And I'd do this 1,000 times over if it meant keeping him safe." Emma closed her eyes for a moment, nodding as tears slipped down her cheeks. She didn't try to argue with him anymore. There was nothing left to say. A nurse entered, signaling that it was time, and Daniel stood, glancing once more at Noah before letting them lead him away. The last thing he saw before the doors swung shut behind him was Emma, standing motionless in the center of the room, arms wrapped around herself as though trying to hold together the pieces of a life that had already fallen apart. The surgery was a blur of sterile lights, murmured voices, and the sharp scent of antiseptic. He had been through countless high-pressure situations in his life, but none had ever carried the weight of this. Lying on that operating table, he wasn't a billionaire, a CEO, or a man consumed by betrayal. He was simply a father, willing to sacrifice a part of himself for the child he loved. When he woke up, it was to the soft hum of machines and the dull ache in his side. Blinking against the haze of medication, he turned his head, heart stuttering when he saw a small figure sitting curled up in the chair beside him. Noah. He was awake. Tears burned at the back of Daniel's throat as he took in the sight of his son, his cheeks still pale, but his eyes more alert than they had been in weeks. Relief crashed over him, so strong it nearly stole his breath. "Hey, buddy," he rasped, his throat dry, voice hoarse. Noah's lips curved into a sleepy smile. "Hi, Daddy." Daniel's chest tightened painfully. He reached out, his hand shaky, and Noah immediately grasped it, small fingers curling around his. For a long moment, Daniel just held on, feeling the warmth, the life, the undeniable bond that no revelation could erase. "You did so good," he murmured, brushing a hand over Noah's hair. Noah's eyes fluttered sleepily. "So did you." Daniel let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Nah, I think you had the harder job." Noah hummed in drowsy agreement, his grip loosening as sleep started to pull him under again. But before he drifted off completely, he whispered, "I love you, Daddy." The words hit Daniel straight in the heart. He swallowed past the lump in his throat, squeezing Noah's hand gently. "I love you too, buddy." As Noah's breathing evened out, Daniel let his eyes close, exhaustion finally settling over him. The pain in his side was nothing compared to the ache he had carried in his chest these past few days. But here, now, in this moment, there was only one truth that mattered. Noah was safe. He was healing. And no matter what had happened, he was still his son. When Daniel woke again, the room was quiet, save for the soft beeping of the monitors. The haze of medication had lessened, and with it came the full realization that the surgery was done. He had done what he came here to do. The door creaked open, and he turned his head to see Emma standing there, hesitation clear in her posture. "He's doing well," she said softly, stepping inside. "The doctors are saying everything looks good." Daniel nodded, relief washing over him again. "Good." Emma lingered near the foot of the bed, wringing her hands. "Daniel, I don't know how to thank you." He exhaled slowly, looking away. "You don't have to thank me, Emma. He's my son." Emma sucked in a quiet breath, guilt flickering across her face. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," she whispered. "But I want you to know that everything I did, every choice I made, was because I loved him. And I loved you." Daniel didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure he could. He believed her. He believed that she had made the choices she had out of love. But love didn't erase betrayal. It didn't undo the years he had spent living a lie. Finally, he met her gaze, his voice steady. "I don't hate you, Emma. But things can't go back to the way they were." Emma's chin trembled, but she nodded. "I know." There was a long silence, heavy but not quite suffocating. Then, softly, Emma said, "Noah's going to be okay. That's what matters." Daniel nodded, glancing over at their son, still sleeping peacefully. "Yeah," he murmured. "That's what matters." As Emma quietly left the room, Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The pain of the past few days still lingered, still settled in his bones like a weight he would carry for a long time. But for the first time since this nightmare began, there was clarity. Noah was healing. And maybe, just maybe, so was he. Daniel had always believed that clarity would bring peace. But as he sat alone in his office, staring at the envelope on his desk, he realized clarity had only brought more questions. The transplant had been a success. Noah was recovering, his little body regaining its strength, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel could breathe again. But beneath that relief, something gnawed at him, a quiet, insistent voice in the back of his mind that wouldn't let go of the one detail that didn't make sense. He had been a match. Emma's confession had been devastating, but he had accepted it. What choice did he have? She had made a mistake, a selfish, life-altering mistake, but he had believed her. He had believed that Noah wasn't his biological son, that his connection to the boy he loved had been built on nothing more than the role he had stepped into, not the blood that ran through their veins. But the transplant results had cast doubt on everything. The odds of being a compatible donor for a child who wasn't biologically his were slim. And though the doctors had explained that some unrelated donors could still be a match, something inside him wouldn't settle. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a certainty. He needed to know for sure. Not because it would change how he felt about Noah, but because if there was even a chance that Emma had been wrong, then he deserved to know the truth. So he had done what he always did when doubt crept in, he sought out facts. A discreet test, a simple request to a private lab, no questions asked. He hadn't told Emma, hadn't told anyone. If the results confirmed what she had told him, then at least he could put this gnawing uncertainty to rest. But if they didn't? His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the envelope. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself before he carefully peeled it open, sliding the crisp white paper into his hands. His eyes skimmed over the neatly printed words, processing each line mechanically until his gaze landed on the result. 99.9% probability of paternity. Daniel's breath hitched. His mind stalled. He read the line again. And again. But the words didn't change. Noah was his son. The air in the room felt suddenly too thin. His pulse pounded in his ears, and for a brief moment, he couldn't think, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at the paper in front of him. He felt unsteady, like the floor had shifted beneath him. All these weeks, all the pain, all the nights spent questioning his place in Noah's life, none of it had been necessary. Emma had been wrong. A sharp exhale left his lips, somewhere between a laugh and a disbelieving gasp. His hands clenched around the paper, fingers tightening as if he needed to physically hold on to the truth in front of him. Noah was his. Not just in the way that mattered, not just in love or devotion, but in blood. In genetics. In every way that he had been led to believe was impossible. The betrayal he had felt, the heartbreak of believing that his family had never truly been his, it had all been built on a falsehood. Emma's mistake had cost them everything. His jaw clenched, a fresh wave of anger rising in his chest. How could she have been so certain? How could she have told him something so devastating without ever questioning it? Had she ever even considered that she might have been wrong? Had she ever truly wanted to know the truth? He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he grabbed his phone. His hands were steady now, his resolve hardened. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to him. Emma answered on the third ring, her voice quiet, hesitant. "Daniel? We need to talk." There was a pause, the kind of silence that only existed when someone knew they were about to face something they weren't prepared for. "Okay," she finally said. "I'll come over." 20 minutes later, she was standing in his office, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression wary. It was the first time they had been alone since the transplant, and for a moment, he simply looked at her, studying the woman he had once loved, the woman who had, for better or worse, shaped so much of his life. She shifted under his gaze. "What is this about?" Without a word, Daniel slid the paternity test across the desk. Emma frowned, hesitating before picking it up. Her eyes skimmed the results, and as realization dawned, her face paled. She looked up at him, lips parted, but no words came out. "You were wrong," Daniel said, his voice low, steady. "Noah is mine." Emma's hand trembled as she placed the paper back down. I don't understand." "Neither did I," he admitted. "Not at first. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. So I ordered the test." He let the weight of his words settle. "And now I know the truth." Emma swallowed hard, her breath shaky. "I never meant to lie to you, Daniel. I swear I thought you thought." He interrupted, his voice sharper now. "You assumed. And because of that, you let me believe a lie. You let me grieve a son that was never lost to me." Tears welled in her eyes. "I thought I was protecting you." Daniel let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "No, Emma. You were protecting yourself. You were protecting the story you told yourself, the one where your mistake didn't matter because you had already made up your mind about what was true." He took a step closer, his eyes locked onto hers. "You stole my son from me. You let me walk away from our marriage believing that I had lost something irreplaceable. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" Emma wiped at her tears, shaking her head. "I was scared." "So was I," he said, voice quieter now, raw with emotion. "I was terrified. But I still stayed. I still fought for Noah, even when I thought he wasn't mine. And you? You never even considered the possibility that you were wrong." Emma's shoulders sagged, her body folding in on itself as if she were collapsing under the weight of her own guilt. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. Daniel exhaled slowly, the anger still there, but something else simmering beneath it, acceptance. "You can't," he said simply. "And I don't think I can ever forgive you for this." A broken sob escaped her lips, but she nodded, as if she had already known the answer. "But," he continued, glancing toward the framed picture of Noah on his desk, "we have a son to raise. And I won't let him suffer for our mistakes. Emma wiped her tears, taking a shaky breath. Neither will I. There was no resolution in her voice, no expectation of redemption. Just an understanding that some things could never be undone. As she turned to leave, Daniel let out another slow breath, his chest lighter than it had been in weeks. His marriage was over. His trust in Emma was shattered. But his son? His son was his. And that, at least, was something real. The divorce papers sat on Daniel's desk for 3 days before he finally signed them. He had gone over them repeatedly, reading each clause, each division of assets, each line that detailed the dissolution of a life he had once thought would last forever. There was nothing left to fight over. Emma hadn't contested anything. She hadn't begged him to stay, hadn't tried to negotiate a different outcome. She had simply accepted it with quiet resignation, her signature already in place, as though she had known all along that there was no salvaging what she had broken. The ink felt heavier than it should have as he pressed the pen to the paper, his name curling neatly at the bottom of the last page. It was done. Legally, officially, irreversibly done. There was no more husband and wife. Just two people bound only by the little boy sleeping peacefully in the next room. When the papers were filed, Emma had sent him a simple text, "Thank you for handling everything. I hope one day, when enough time has passed, you can remember the good parts of us too." Daniel had stared at the message for longer than he cared to admit, his thumb hovering over the keyboard, debating whether or not to respond. In the end, he simply locked his phone and set it aside. There was nothing left to say. The weeks that followed were quiet, filled with routine and a careful, almost mechanical transition into co-parenting. Emma moved into an apartment across town, close enough to make exchanges with Noah easy, but far enough that their lives no longer overlapped. They kept things simple, civil. No outbursts, no lingering resentment spilling into conversations about their son. They spoke only about Noah, his school, his health, what foods he was suddenly refusing to eat. They never discussed what had happened between them, never revisited the wounds still too fresh to be touched. Noah, mercifully, remained oblivious. To him, the world had only shifted slightly. Mommy lived in a new place, but Daddy still picked him up every morning for school, still played with him on weekends, still tucked him into bed on the nights he stayed over. Daniel had made a promise to himself that no matter how much he had lost, Noah would never feel the weight of it. His son would never wonder if he was loved. He would never question whether his parents' choices had taken anything away from him. Work became a refuge. Daniel threw himself into his company, taking on new projects, expanding operations, ensuring that there was no space left in his mind for thoughts that led nowhere good. He rebuilt the barriers he had once let down, reinforcing them with the kind of resolve that came from knowing exactly how much damage trust could do. He told himself he was fine. That he didn't need more than what he had, his son, his company, the structure of his life before Emma had unraveled it. But there were nights when the house felt too quiet. When he'd sit in Noah's room after his son had gone to sleep, watching the soft rise and fall of his small chest, and wonder how it was possible to feel both full and empty at the same time. He had his son. He had everything that mattered. But there were moments, brief but sharp, where he still felt the ghost of something else. The absence of something he no longer had words for. Emma, for her part, seemed to accept the new terms of their life without protest. She picked up Noah on her scheduled days, sent polite texts when necessary, never lingered too long at drop-offs or pickups. She never asked about Daniel's life outside of fatherhood, never hinted at regret beyond the quiet understanding that there was no fixing what had been done. She looked tired most of the time, worn in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. But he never asked if she was okay. He wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. It was during one of his rare evenings alone that he first saw Amanda again. It had been weeks since the transplant, and he had barely given much thought to anyone outside of his immediate orbit. But there she was, the doctor who assisted the surgeons during the transplant, in the cafe near his office, sitting by the window with a book in her hands, her dark curls falling over one shoulder as she absent-mindedly tapped a spoon against the edge of her coffee cup. She looked the same as she had in the hospital, warm, steady, effortlessly kind. The sort of person who seemed untouched by the kind of complications that had consumed his own life. For a long moment, he debated leaving. It wasn't as though she had seen him yet. He could turn around, walk back out the door, avoid whatever conversation might come from acknowledging her presence. But something held him in place, a pull he didn't fully understand. Before he could talk himself out of it, he stepped forward. "Amanda," he said, his voice breaking the quiet hum of the cafe. She looked up, surprise flickering across her face before it melted into something softer. "Daniel." She closed the book she had been reading, setting it aside. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Yeah, He hesitated, suddenly unsure of what he had intended to say. "I was just getting some air." Her gaze swept over him, as if assessing whether or not she believed that. "How have you been?" It was a simple question, but the answer felt complicated. He could have said fine. Could have given the rehearsed, polished response he had perfected over the past few weeks. But for some reason, standing there in front of her, he found himself saying something else. "I'm figuring it out." Amanda nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. "That's a good place to start." He hesitated, then gestured to the seat across from her. "Mind if I join you?" A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "I'd like that." And just like that, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't some grand, sweeping realization. But as he sat down, as the conversation between them unfolded easily, naturally, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Something lighter. Something that, for the first time in weeks, felt like the beginning of something new. Daniel hadn't expected to see Amanda again after that evening at the cafe. He told himself it was just a coincidence, a brief conversation between two people who had once crossed paths under difficult circumstances. But as the days passed, he found himself thinking about her more often than he wanted to admit. There was something about her presence that felt different, like a space he didn't know he had been missing had quietly started to fill itself in. At first, he resisted it. He had convinced himself that love was a risk he wasn't willing to take again, that the scars of Emma's betrayal were too deep to ever fully fade. He had built his life back up after the divorce, focused on Noah, on his work, on the certainty of things he could control. Amanda, with her easy warmth and the quiet way she seemed to understand him without forcing him to explain himself, was something he hadn't accounted for. And yet, he found himself wanting to see her again. Their paths continued to cross in small, unexpected ways. Once at the hospital when he brought Noah in for a routine checkup, once at the bookstore near his office where she was browsing the shelves with a focused intensity that made him smile. He had hesitated before approaching her that time, unsure if she would even remember him beyond that evening at the cafe. But when she looked up and saw him, her face lit up in a way that felt entirely too easy, too natural. "Daniel," she said, closing the book in her hands. "We have to stop meeting like this." He smirked, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest, something lighter than what he had grown used to carrying. "Or maybe it's just good timing." They started seeing each other more after that. It wasn't anything serious at first, small moments, brief conversations, and occasional coffees shared at the hospital when their schedules aligned. But something about her presence was effortless. She never pried, never pushed him for more than he was ready to give. She simply existed in a way that felt safe, like a space he could step into without fear of it collapsing beneath him. Noah adored her from the moment they met again. He had only vague memories of her from the hospital, but children had an instinct for kindness, and Amanda carried it in a way that was impossible to ignore. She didn't try to force a bond with him, didn't treat him like something fragile just because he had been sick. She talked to him like he was important, like his thoughts and ideas mattered, and Daniel could see the way Noah thrived under that attention. One evening, as they sat together at a quiet restaurant, Amanda leaned back in her chair and studied him with a soft curiosity. "You always look like you're waiting for something," she observed. Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She tilted her head, as if considering her words. "Like you're bracing yourself." Like you're expecting something to go wrong. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over the edge of his glass. I guess old habits die hard. She didn't push him to elaborate, didn't try to fill the silence with meaningless reassurances. Instead, she simply nodded, as if she understood more than he was willing to say. You know, she said after a moment, not everything is a risk. He met her gaze, something tightening in his chest. It feels like it is. She smiled then, but it wasn't pitying or soft. It was steady. Maybe it's just a choice. Daniel didn't have an answer for that, but the thought lingered long after the evening had ended. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't expected. She didn't ask about Emma, and he didn't offer details beyond what was necessary. But she listened when he talked about Noah, when he spoke about the moments that had shaped him into the father he was. And in return, she shared parts of herself, stories about her own childhood, about the patients she had lost and the ones who had reminded her why she chose this life. There was a balance between them, something unspoken but deeply understood. One evening, after a long day, Amanda stopped by his house to drop off a book she had mentioned to him earlier in the week. It was something small, something casual, but when she stepped inside, Noah ran to her as if she had been a part of his world forever. Amanda! He exclaimed, wrapping his small arms around her waist. Guess what? I built the biggest tower with my blocks today. Amanda laughed, crouching down so she was at his level. The biggest? Are you sure? How tall are we talking? Noah stretched his arms as high as they could go, grinning. This tall? Wow, she said, her expression full of mock seriousness. That's got to be at least as tall as a skyscraper. Daniel watched the exchange from the kitchen, something warm settling in his chest. Noah had always been a happy child, but there was something about the way he looked at Amanda that made Daniel pause. He trusted her in a way that felt effortless, in a way Daniel hadn't seen him trust anyone outside of his parents. Later that night, after Noah had fallen asleep, Amanda lingered near the door, hesitating slightly before speaking. You're an incredible father, you know. Daniel let out a quiet breath, leaning against the wall. I try. You do more than try, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Noah knows he's loved. That's all that really matters. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. There was something about the way she spoke, the way she existed in his life without expectation or demand, that made him feel as though, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't walking alone. You make it sound so simple, he said finally. She smiled, tilting her head slightly. Maybe it is. He didn't know how to explain what was shifting inside him, but he knew this, he wasn't afraid of her. Not in the way he had been afraid to trust again, to let someone close enough to hurt him. Amanda wasn't Emma. She wasn't a reminder of what he had lost. She was something else entirely, something new, something steady, something that felt like a choice he might actually be willing to make. As she stepped toward the door, she paused, glancing back at him. I'll see you soon? Daniel nodded. Yeah, he said, his voice quieter than usual. You will. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to move forward. The soft hum of children's laughter filled the backyard, mingling with the warm afternoon air as a handful of kids ran across the grass, their voices rising in excitement. Noah's birthday had arrived, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something close to normalcy. The past year had been one of upheaval, of heartbreak and rebuilding, but today wasn't about any of that. Today was about Noah. Daniel stood by the patio, watching as his son sat cross-legged on the grass, completely enthralled by a magic trick one of the entertainers was performing. The way his face lit up, the pure joy in his eyes, it was a reminder of why everything Daniel had fought for was worth it. Noah was healthy, happy, surrounded by love. That was all that mattered. Emma stood a few feet away, chatting with one of the other parents. They had agreed early on that whatever had happened between them, Noah would always come first. The wounds between them hadn't fully healed, and maybe they never would, but there was an unspoken understanding that they had to be better for their son. They weren't the same people they had been when they built their life together, but they could still find a way to exist in each other's lives without resentment poisoning the air between them. Emma caught his gaze and gave him a small, tentative smile. He returned it, nodding slightly. There was no bitterness there, no anger left to hold on to. She would always be Noah's mother, and despite everything, she had never stopped loving their son. That would have to be enough. A gentle hand brushed against his, and he turned to find Amanda standing beside him. She had been there from the start of the party, blending into Noah's world as effortlessly as she always did. She hadn't tried to take up space she wasn't meant to fill, hadn't forced herself into moments that weren't hers. But somehow, over the past few months, she had become part of something Daniel hadn't realized he had been missing. "He's having a great time," Amanda said, her eyes following Noah as he jumped up to show off one of his new toys to a group of his friends. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, he is. You did good," she added softly, her voice filled with quiet reassurance. He glanced at her, studying the way the sunlight caught the warmth in her eyes, the way she had a way of grounding him without ever needing to say much at all. She had been patient with him, never pushing, never expecting anything he wasn't ready to give. And somewhere along the way, without him even realizing it, she had become more than just someone he saw in passing. She had become someone he cared about. Someone he trusted. "Couldn't have done it without you," he admitted, and it wasn't just about today. Amanda smiled, tilting her head slightly. "I think you could have. But I'm glad I was here anyway." A commotion near the cake table drew their attention, and Daniel chuckled as Noah eagerly climbed onto a chair, his little hands already reaching for the candles before Emma gently guided them away. The sight of the two of them standing side by side, helping Noah prepare for his big moment, sent a pang of something bittersweet through Daniel's chest. This wasn't the life he had envisioned for them when they first became parents, but maybe that was okay. Maybe life wasn't meant to be so rigid, so perfectly planned. Maybe it was meant to change, to grow into something unexpected. The cake was placed in front of Noah, and as the backyard filled with the sound of singing, Daniel stepped closer, standing on the other side of his son. When Noah turned to him, his face alight with excitement, Daniel felt something settle inside him, something that had been shifting for months but had finally found its place. Noah squeezed his hand tightly before taking a deep breath and blowing out the candles. Cheers erupted around them, and as the little boy grinned up at his parents, his eyes flickered between them as if checking to make sure everything was still okay. Daniel knelt beside him, ruffling his hair. "Did you make a wish, buddy?" Noah giggled. "Yep." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Gonna tell me what it was?" Noah shook his head with dramatic enthusiasm. "No way! Then it won't come true!" Amanda laughed from nearby, and Noah turned toward her with a bright smile. "Amanda, did you see how fast I blew out the candles?" "I did," she said with a mock-serious nod. "I think that means your wish is definitely going to come true." Noah beamed at her before turning back to Daniel. "Can we open presents now?" Daniel chuckled, standing up. "Go for it, kid." As Noah rushed off, Daniel met Emma's gaze. There was something unreadable in her expression, something softer than he had seen in a long time. She nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had brought them to this moment. They weren't what they used to be, but maybe that was okay. As the party wound down and guests started filtering out, Amanda lingered behind, helping gather plates and cups while Noah ran circles around the backyard, still buzzing with excitement. Emma had left earlier, giving Noah one last hug before promising to see him in the morning. Now, it was just the three of them. Daniel walked over to where Amanda was stacking plates, reaching out to take them from her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I don't mind," she replied, but she let him take them anyway. For a long moment, they stood there, the quiet settling around them in a way that didn't feel awkward or forced. It felt right. Amanda shifted slightly, glancing at Noah before looking back at Daniel. "You know, He's going to be okay. And so are you. Daniel studied her, taking in the quiet confidence in her voice, the way she said it as if it were fact, not just something she hoped was true. Yeah, he said finally. I think we will be. Later that night, after Noah had finally exhausted himself from all the excitement, Daniel tucked him into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin. Noah blinked sleepily up at him, his little fingers reaching out to grasp Daniel's hand. Best birthday ever, he murmured, his voice already heavy with sleep. Daniel smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. I'm glad you had fun, buddy. Noah's grip tightened slightly. I love you, Dad. The words settled deep in Daniel's chest, filling spaces he hadn't even realized were still empty. He squeezed Noah's hand gently, leaning down to press a kiss to his forehead. I love you too, kiddo. As he sat in the quiet of his home later that night, sipping a glass of whiskey on the patio, he let himself feel something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. He had lost things along the way, had fought through heartbreak and betrayal, but he had also gained something unexpected. A new kind of family. A new kind of love. He wasn't sure where things with Amanda would go, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of the future. He had fought for Noah's life. And somewhere along the way, he had found his own second chance at happiness. Daniel's journey was one of heartbreak, betrayal, and ultimately healing. He faced the unimaginable, discovering that the family he thought he had was built on a lie, only to realize that love isn't defined by DNA but by the choices we make. Through it all, he never wavered in his devotion to his son, and in the end, he didn't just save Noah's life, he found the strength to rebuild his own. Sometimes, the hardest moments lead us to the most unexpected blessings. Daniel's story is proof that even after loss, love can find its way back into our lives. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more emotional and thought-provoking content. And let us know, what would you do if you were in Daniel's shoes? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.